The ATF used to be an unstoppable force, an all-powerful federal agency that could swoop into any home and seize whatever they wanted. Now everything is changing, and the cracks in their authority grow larger every day. In this video, we'll talk about how the rise of legal marijuana, combined with a string of court battles, has put the ATF on the defensive and opened the door for unprecedented 2A victories we never would have thought were possible. For decades, Americans watched in frustration as the ATF engaged in heavy-handed raids and enforced murky interpretations of the law, chipping away at our right to keep and bear arms. But a series of legal rulings, capped off by the groundbreaking Bruen decision, has shifted the burden of proof back onto the federal government, forcing it to justify every infringement on the Second Amendment. Suddenly, the same agency that used to treat gun owners like criminals is facing intense scrutiny in court, and they don't seem to have the footing to withstand it. Combine that with the fact that more states are legalizing marijuana, creating a direct conflict with outdated federal firearms regulations, and you've got the perfect recipe for the ATF to lose control. Whether you call it poetic justice or simply the result of unstoppable social and political changes, one thing is obvious: the ATF's once firm grip is slipping. And for all of us who've been arguing that federal agencies have no business dictating how and when responsible citizens can exercise their constitutional rights, this moment couldn't come soon enough. To understand how it reached this turning point, let's first look at the ATF's long-running struggle to undermine the very core of the Second Amendment. For decades, this agency has operated with broad discretion, crafting rules and redefining terms to tighten the noose on lawful gun owners. Some of their most infamous actions include raids that rely on questionable warrants, murky language around what constitutes a legal firearm accessory, and a habit of moving the goalposts whenever it suits them. Perhaps the most glaring example of their heavy-handed approach can be seen in cases like the one involving Mark Chapa, a gun owner whose home was raided pre-dawn, complete with flashbang grenades, because of flimsy evidence from a so-called confidential informant. When the ATF failed to find any contraband, they left behind a wrecked house and a traumatized family, underscoring the agency's blatant disregard for due process. Recent court decisions have begun to rein in these abuses. The Bruen decision, for instance, clarified that the government can't simply claim an interest in public safety to justify restrictions on constitutional rights. The burden is now on the government, and by extension, agencies like the ATF, to prove any restriction aligns with the text and historical tradition of the Second Amendment. This reversal has placed the ATF in a precarious position. Every new regulation or enforcement action can be legally challenged, forcing them to defend their overreaching mandates in front of judges who are increasingly skeptical of broad federal power. As more pro-2A advocates step forward with lawsuits, the ATF finds itself on a defensive footing it has never really experienced before. Over time, the agency's antagonistic posture has not only alienated gun owners, but also begun to push away moderates who once thought the ATF played a necessary role. People are now waking up to the reality that these raids and reinterpretations of law do little more than intimidate responsible citizens, while doing next to nothing to reduce violent crime. With each legal defeat, the ATF's credibility erodes further, clearing the way for bigger challenges to its authority in the near future. One of the most fascinating angles of the ATF's current crisis is how it has been forced to confront the nationwide shift in attitudes toward marijuana. Traditionally, the federal government has labeled marijuana a Schedule I drug, effectively claiming it is more dangerous and has less medical value than substances like methamphetamines or cocaine. This classification is beyond outdated, especially since a growing number of states are legalizing cannabis either for medical or recreational use, or both. Yet under federal law, if you use cannabis, even if it's legal in your state, you're technically prohibited from owning a firearm. The ATF has long used this as a tool to ensnare gun owners in legal jeopardy by claiming that anyone who admits to cannabis use on federal paperwork or tests positive could face criminal charges for possessing guns. Recently, we've seen this confrontational stance crumble in court. A pivotal case out of El Paso, Texas showed just how fragile the federal government's position is when it comes to stripping gun rights from individuals who lawfully use marijuana under state laws. In that case, a man with a medical marijuana card from New Mexico was arrested when Texas authorities found a significant amount of weed and a firearm. While the local charges fizzled out, federal prosecutors tried to nail him under the statute that prohibits gun ownership by unlawful drug users. However, thanks to the Bruen standard, the court ruled that this prohibition couldn't stand, as it failed to meet the rigorous historical test for restricting constitutional rights. This ruling is monumental because it wasn't some trivial amount of marijuana. We're talking about substantial evidence of cannabis possession, yet the court still found the federal statute unconstitutional as applied to him. If the government can't uphold its ban in this kind of clear-cut scenario, how can it possibly justify punishing someone in a state like Colorado or California who has a medical recommendation and a few grams of cannabis at home? This outcome signals that the ATF is rapidly losing its ability to selectively enforce federal gun laws against marijuana users. More importantly, it underscores a broader reality. As states continue to break from outdated federal drug policies, the ATF finds itself in a legal tug-of-war where its enforcement powers look increasingly weak. Imagine the scenario: a responsible gun owner, fully compliant with their state's medical marijuana regulations, is now on the wrong side of federal law simply because the ATF hasn't updated its thinking since the 1970s. The courts are pushing back, and every new decision that finds these prohibitions unconstitutional further exposes the cracks in the ATF's authority. For gun owners who also happen to be cannabis users in states where it's legal, this is a win for personal freedom and a stark lesson in how federal agencies can become obsolete when they refuse to adapt to changing social norms. The current instability within the ATF goes beyond legal losses. It extends to its leadership vacuum. When Steve Dettelbach announced his resignation just ahead of Trump's inauguration, it left many observers wondering about the agency's future direction. The timing seemed almost too convenient, hinting that he might be stepping aside to avoid clashing with a new administration less friendly to the ATF's expansive view of its own powers. This uncertainty in leadership compounds the agency's vulnerabilities, as no new director can simply wave a magic wand and fix all of the ATF's constitutional issues. Speculation has run wild about whom Trump, or any future president with a strong pro-2A stance, might nominate to lead the agency. Some have joked about appointing outspoken gun rights activists like Brandon Herrera, Ted Nugent, or other high-profile figures who would never make it through a Senate confirmation hearing. The real point behind these tongue-in-cheek suggestions is to draw attention to the ATF's mission creep and highlight the absurdity of an agency that often operates more like a political player than an impartial enforcer of federal statutes. Realistically, the path Trump or another pro-2A president might take could be to install a caretaker director who simply enforces existing law without trying to push any new agenda. That alone would represent a seismic shift in how the ATF functions, given its history of stretching legal definitions and proactively seeking ways to regulate firearms. Regardless of who steps into the leadership role, the combined pressures of legal challenges, public opinion, and ongoing political drama make it increasingly difficult for the ATF to continue operating like it always has. The days of blanket authority and unquestioned deference may be long gone. As the ATF's troubles pile up, a growing movement has emerged to do more than just rein in the agency. It aims to abolish the ATF altogether. Lawmakers like Lauren Boebert have introduced bills to dismantle the Bureau, arguing that it's not only unnecessary but also inherently hostile to the Constitution. While such legislation may face an uphill battle in Congress, the fact that it's being introduced and taken seriously by segments of the public underscores a seismic shift in attitudes toward the ATF. Where once people might have dismissed calls to abolish the agency as fringe rhetoric, many are now asking whether an agency with a track record of abusive raids, shifting rules, and questionable accountability should exist at all. The argument for disbanding the ATF is simple. The agency's original mandate was to regulate alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and later explosives, but over time it's evolved into an aggressive enforcer of often unclear federal regulations that target lawful gun owners more than actual criminals. Critics point out that major violent crimes and large-scale trafficking operations often fall under the jurisdiction of other federal bodies, leaving the ATF to focus on paperwork infractions and gotcha tactics aimed at everyday Americans. For example, busting down someone's door at dawn because an informant claims they're storing a device that might be illegal is a far cry from what most people consider legitimate crime fighting. Furthermore, the ATF has demonstrated a willingness to use tactics that many describe as terrorizing. Agents regularly rely on flashbang grenades, forced entries, and intimidation, even when dealing with individuals who have no history of violence. This approach, combined with the ATF's infamous secrecy around confidential informants, has led many to view the Bureau as a rogue institution more interested in racking up enforcement stats than ensuring public safety. In some cases, property is destroyed, families are traumatized, and no arrests are made because there was never any actual wrongdoing. Such actions only deepen the distrust gun owners have for the agency and fuel the calls for its abolition. Beyond these enforcement tactics, the ATF's rulemaking process often seems designed to confuse rather than clarify. Whether it's determining what constitutes a stabilizing brace or redefining the term machine gun, the agency frequently moves the goalposts after people have already invested time and money into following what they believe to be legal guidelines. This endless flip-flopping can turn lawful citizens into accidental felons overnight, eroding the agency's credibility and stoking public anger. Combined with recent court victories that limit the ATF's interpretation of historical precedents, these shifting rules are under a bright spotlight that reveals just how shaky the agency's foundation has become. So what would happen if the ATF were abolished? Critics argue that its essential tasks could be folded into other agencies or devolved to state authorities that better reflect local values and constitutional safeguards. While some worry about a vacuum in enforcement, supporters of abolition note that local law enforcement and the FBI already handle the bulk of real criminal activities involving firearms. Removing the ATF would simply eliminate a layer of redundant and often constitutionally dubious bureaucracy. In a climate where many Americans are reevaluating the role of federal agencies, the call to abolish the ATF gains more traction each time the Bureau overreaches and faces a humiliating setback in court or in the court of public opinion. For gun owners, the ATF's weakening grip is a moment of both opportunity and caution. On one hand, each court ruling that strikes down an outdated or overreaching law makes it easier for lawful citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights without fear of arbitrary prosecution. On the other hand, it's still important to remember that federal law technically remains on the books until it's formally removed or universally invalidated. This means if you're a gun owner who also partakes in marijuana, whether medically or recreationally, it's crucial to stay aware of the ongoing legal battles and any potential risks. While the trend is definitely moving in a pro-2A direction, the federal government hasn't yet changed its stance on cannabis being a Schedule I substance. Practically speaking, the best defense for gun owners at this juncture is knowledge. Follow reputable Second Amendment advocacy organizations, keep up with legislative updates in your state, and know your rights if you happen to interact with law enforcement. It's also important to support legal challenges that test the ATF's power in court because these rulings set precedents that can eventually dismantle unjust regulations nationwide. Every time a judge cites Bruen or another key decision to strike down an ATF rule, it adds another nail in the coffin of federal overreach. The silver lining here is that the ATF's struggles show how constitutional rights can indeed be reclaimed when citizens and courts are willing to stand up for them. Even something as divisive as marijuana, once considered an absolute deal-breaker for owning firearms, now looks vulnerable to constitutional challenges. The lesson for all of us is that complacency is the only real threat to freedom. As soon as people stop accepting agencies like the ATF as all-powerful and start demanding they respect constitutional boundaries, the seemingly untouchable walls of federal control begin to crumble. But that's going to do it for now. If this video was helpful in any way, please like, share it with your Pro-2A friends to spread awareness, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue making more of these types of content for you. Click on the bell icon too while you're at it. Thanks for watching.